So we've been over the overview for the 8-week plan, which is this screen here. We've said exactly what we're doing in week 1, exactly what we're doing in week 2, exactly what we're doing in week 3, exactly what we're doing in week 4, exactly what we're doing in week 5, exactly what you're doing in week 6, exactly what we're doing in week 7, and then exactly what we're doing in week 8. Now, this is the template that Focus Fitness give you to work through, and you can edit these boxes as you see fit. So if you decide that you're doing cardiovascular training and resistance training on the same day, then you can use this template, merge the boxes, and make them suit your case study. If we look here, there's a few bits of information that you have to include so that your assessor can see your plan and see the progression within your plan. You must include a minimum of 2 CV training days in each week. You must also include a minimum of 2 resistance training days in each week. There's some acute variables that you need to tell us on the 8-week plan. So the first one is the name of the training system, the time, the intensity in its simplest format, which can be RPE, or in its hardest format, which could be heart rate reserve calculation. If you're doing interval training, you need to tell us the work to rest or recovery ratios. And in an ideal world, you'll tell us whether this workout is aerobic or anaerobic, or possibly even a combination of the two. Also, we need to know the number of intervals if it is an interval session, and the piece of equipment that you plan to use. For resistance training, we need to know the percentage of 1 rep max using the chart that we give you. We need to know the rest period, the tempo of the movement, the name of the training system, and the body approach. So are we doing whole body training on one day? Are we doing upper body on one day? Are we doing lower body on another day? Are we doing chest and triceps on one day, back and biceps on another day? So the choice is yours as to how you split up the body, as long as the body parts that you're trying to target get trained 1 to 2 times per week. You must also name the core exercise. We need to know the duration of the exercise if it's stability. So for example, if it's a plank, maybe you're holding 1 set of 30 seconds. If it's repetition based, like a wood chop, then maybe it's 2 sets of 15 repetitions with a 60-second rest period. For those of you looking to excel on your case study, you can enter the name of P and F muscles, so the stretches that you want to do. But please read here where it says it is optional and it is not part of the assessment. So it's not something that you actually have to do. If we now look at this case study or 8-week plan that I've prepared, you'll see that on Monday, it's a cardiovascular training day. Tuesday is a resistance training day. Wednesday is a day off, as it doesn't appear on here. Thursday is a cardiovascular training day. And Friday is a resistance training day. So on day 1, on the Monday, the name of the CV approach is continuous. The piece of equipment that I'm going to use is the rower. The time is 15 minutes. The intensity is measured at an RPE of 7, and it is aerobic training. The core exercise is 2 times 30 seconds plank and a front plank. Each side active rest by changing sides. I am going above the assessment criteria here by putting in P and F on hamstrings, but remember your assessor doesn't need to see this, but the minimum they need to see is the cardiovascular training approach, the kit, the time, the intensity, and whether it's aerobic or anaerobic training. On day 2, the resistance training day, the name of the resistance training system is supersets, and it's agonist versus antagonist, so opposite muscle supersets. There are 8 exercises to perform on the day. There's 2 sets of 12 repetitions at 67% of the 1 rep max, a 2-to-2 tempo with 60 seconds rest. This cardiovascular training day, so Thursday, is literally exactly the same as day 1. So I can copy and paste that information into here, or if I'm writing it by hand, I could even write in this box, same as CV day 1. The same applies for the Friday, the resistance training day. I could have written in this box the same as day 2, or the same as Tuesday. In week 2, I've added on 1 minute to the cardiovascular workout. So the training approach is still continuous. The equipment is still the rower. And you can see here where it's gone to 16 minutes from 15 minutes. Thus, there is progression across this workout by 1 minute. In the resistance training, now I've got supersets with forced repetitions. So that's the supersets was the first training approach, resistance training approach out of my 4. And forced reps is the final training approach, the second training approach out of my 4 training approaches. To demonstrate to the assessor that I'm using forced repetitions in the final set, I've had to put the intensity up. So you can see here where I'm highlighting in yellow, in the final set of each exercise, I've put the intensity up to 75% of the 1 RM, which means that it's a weight that the client couldn't lift for 12 repetitions without me being there to help them on the way up on most exercises. The tempo is still 2-to-2 and the rest is still 60 seconds. Now you can see here again, Thursday's cardiovascular training day is exactly the same as Monday's. Friday's resistance training day is exactly the same as Tuesday's. You can also see here that I've put it in bold every time I've changed resistance training system or cardiovascular training system, so that my assessor can clearly see where I've put my training approaches in this 8-week plan. In week 3, I've added on an extra 2 minutes to the rower, which means it's making this exercise harder. I've added on 1 set of work to the core exercises. So rather than it being 2 sets of 30 seconds on the planks, now I'm doing 3 sets of 30 seconds. The resistance training has stayed exactly the same because I've made quite a big jump by adding on 2 minutes to cardiovascular training and added 1 extra set to core exercises. When we get to week 4, you can see that there's been a bold change here. So now I've changed the cardiovascular training approach from being a continuous approach to now a fartlek approach. I've brought the time back down to 15 minutes because I've advanced the training system. And this time, because it's a fartlek, there needs to be a range of intensity. It can't just be RPE 7 anymore. It needs to have a varied range. So I've decided to work my client between an RPE of 5 and an RPE of 8, which is right on the cusp of it being aerobic or anaerobic training. So I've said that this is aerobic training. I've left the core exercises exactly the same. And you can see here, I've left the resistance training exactly the same. And this information was taken from my overview. Thursday's cardiovascular training day is exactly the same as Monday's. Friday's resistance training day is exactly the same as Tuesday's. So you can see I've kept 2 cardiovascular workouts in each week, and I've kept 2 resistance workouts in each week. Now we've got to week 5. I've left the cardiovascular training exactly the same as it was in the previous week in week 4. I've left the core training exactly the same as it was in week 4. The progression that I've made this week is adding on eccentric training system on the final set of some of the exercises, and there's still 8 exercises for resistance training. How do we know that it's eccentric training? Well, the key is to look here. Rather than it being 75% of the 1 RM for 12 repetitions, now it's 85% of the 1 RM for 12 repetitions. Now, when you look at the resistance training videos, you'll see what I've done here. I've picked a weight that my client can only lift for 6 repetitions, which means they need help on the upward phase of most exercises for at least 4 to 5 repetitions, and then they will need help on the way up and the way down of the exercise because they wouldn't be able to take that whole weight. Thus, it is eccentrically overloading the client. Once again, Thursday is exactly the same as Monday's workout, and Friday is exactly the same as Tuesday's workout. In week 6, you can see here that I've written in the side of the box a deload, which is exactly the same as a recovery week in training. The reason I've done it is to allow for adaptation. So if my client was after putting on some muscular size or some hypertrophy, if I just make the workouts harder and harder and harder every single week, the likelihood is the client will get an injury or they will overtrain and not achieve their goal. So the CV approach is continuous. I've changed the equipment and used the cross trainer. Now the reason I've done this is it says in your case study brief that you have to use a variety of cardiovascular training kit. As I've used the rower and the cross trainer, I've covered that criteria here. You can see the core exercises are exactly the same as they were in week 1. You can also see now that the resistance training is exactly the same as it was in week 1, which means it's clearly not as hard as it was in weeks 4 and 5. Thus, the client is now having a recovery week or a deload week. Once again, Thursday's training is exactly the same as Monday's training, and Friday's training is exactly the same as Tuesday's training, meaning that we've still got 2 cardiovascular workouts in each week and 2 resistance training workouts in each week. Now, as we move into week 7, there's 2 bold changes here. One is for the core exercise and one is for the resistance training. So I've reverted back to the cardiovascular training approach that appeared in week 5. Fartlek, 15 minutes, RPE 5 to 8, aerobic training on the rower. And you can see here that in week 7, it's exactly the same as it was in week 5. The core exercise has now changed. We've got 2 times 12 cable wood chops with active rest by swapping sides. So the client would exercise rotating one way using the cable machine, then turn around and exercise facing the opposite way using the cable machine. You can now see here that we're on the 4th resistance training system because we've already used a superset, forced repetitions, eccentric training, and now we're using pyramids. You can see here that the rep range 12, 10 and 8 is aiming at hypertrophy for my client. There's 8 exercises in total, and it's an ascending pyramid that I've written out here, which means we start with the lightest weight in the first set, so 12 repetitions at 67% of the 1 rep max, and we've got a specific rest period here, 60 seconds. After that 60 seconds, my client puts the weight up to 75% of their 1 rep max. They perform 10 repetitions, and then they take a longer rest period, which is 70 seconds. In the final set of each exercise, they perform 1 set of 8 repetitions at 80% of the 1 rep max, and they now have 80 seconds rest. The tempo is now at a 2-to-2 tempo. If you're wondering where this information has come from in terms of 12 repetitions at 67% of the 1 RM and 10 repetitions at 75% of the 1 RM, your tutor will give you the following sheet to look at. So you can ask your tutor to email this to you, or at the venue they'll be able to print it out for you. So I had 12 repetitions, and you can see here below it, it says 67, and that's the percentage figure of the estimated 1 RM. So every time on a program I write 12 repetitions, if I'm just working the client to reasonable failure, I should write 67% of the 1 rep max. If I'm going to work at 10 repetitions, it should be 75% of the 1 repetition max. If I want to work at 8 repetitions, it should be at 80% of the 1 repetition max. If I wanted to work my client on forced repetitions, and they were going to do 12 repetitions, I'm unable to write 67% of the 1 rep max because that is a weight that the client could lift without any help from me. So if I'm going to do forced repetitions for 12 reps, your assessor will be looking for you to pick something along the lines of 75% of the 1 rep max, which means your client could do 10 reps by themselves, and you would have to help them with spotting rep 11 and rep 12. If you were to aim to do eccentric training at 12 repetitions, your assessor would be looking to see somewhere between 80 and 85% of the 1 repetition max. This would mean that your client could do 6 reps by themselves. Then you would need to spot them on the concentric phase of rep 7, 8, and potentially 9. And then on rep 10, 11, and 12, you would need to help them with the spotting on the way up and the way down, which would mean you're spotting the concentric phase and the eccentric phase to your desired tempo. To see this being practically applied, look at this eccentric training approach that's on the YouTube channel or on the video list. If we now revert back to the case study, that's shown you where I've got the percentage of the 1RM from. Your tutor will also give you access to the Acute Variables document. Now this document has lots of information on it. It has mirroring movements, so that helps us to plan agonist to antagonist supersets. It gives us some names of exercises that cause opposing movements. It talks about what a compound movement is and what an isolated movement is. And it also gives us information on how many sets we should be planning for endurance training, how many sets we should be planning for hypertrophy, and how many sets we should be planning for strength training. It helps us to understand the rest periods that we should be using for endurance training, the rest periods that we should be using for hypertrophy training, and the rest periods that we should be using for strength training. It helps us to consider how many times we should train each muscle group per week for endurance training, how many times we should train each muscle group for hypertrophy training, and how many weeks we should train each muscle group for strength training. So you can see now, as my client was training for hypertrophy, I needed to train each body part 1 to 2 times per week. I needed to keep my reps between 6 and 12. I needed to keep my sets between 3 and 6. And my rest periods between 60 and 120 seconds, or 1 minute to 2 minutes. So you can now see that 12 reps at 67% of the 1 RM, it's okay to give the client 60 seconds rest. 10 reps at 75% of the 1 RM, it is okay to give my client 70 seconds rest. 1 set of 8 reps at 80% of the 1 RM, you can see why I'm giving my client 80 seconds rest, because the weight is heavier. So this is an ascending pyramid that we can see here. Once again, the cardiovascular training on the Thursday is exactly the same as on the Monday, and the resistance training on the Friday is exactly the same as it was on the Tuesday. And in week 8, I haven't made any changes to the program at all. I've kept everything on here the same as it was in week 7. So using this template is going to help you to plan your progressive 8-week plan, and it helps you to transfer this information onto some program cards, which you will see in the next video. What I would advise you to do is look back at the overview video that we created for you, then have a little look at this 8-week plan, and make sure you're using a template, if not the same as this, very similar to this, so that your assessor can see your progression over the 8 weeks, and they can also see your training systems